You know how much this shop means to me. I'm sorry, Mr. Hale, but there's nothing I can do.
I'm almost finished here. Just take your time, man. Just a bit more right here.
Eviction notice. What is it, Mr. Hale? Just some trouble, son. Nothing to worry about. Is it bad?
Keep your wrists loose. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
And follow the fade line. I ain't cutting hair in here no more. What will you do now, Mr. Hale? Move on. Just move on. Be all right. Watch, I'll show you. I'm headed out, son. It's yours now. Good luck, Hale. I won't let you down.
The neon sign outside the barbershop buzzed softly even after midnight, flickering against the empty Brooklyn street like it was refusing to sleep, and inside the old shop Marcus Hale moved slowly through the silence as if the air itself had weight, his hands still carrying the rhythm of a man who had been cutting hair for more than 20 years. The last customer was gone, the door locked, and only the hum of a small radio playing old soul music filled the space between the red leather chairs and the mirrors that reflected a life Marcus no longer fully trusted. He wiped down the barber tools with steady precision, but his eyes kept drifting toward the back counter where a plain white envelope sat half-hidden beneath a stack of appointment cards, its edges slightly crumpled as if it had already been opened too many times in his mind. Marcus did not need to read the word eviction again to feel it pressing against his chest like a second heartbeat. Every sound in the shop seemed louder tonight, the sweep of the broom, the soft clink of metal scissors, even his own breathing as he tried to stay calm. A young apprentice named Caleb lingered near the mirror pretending to organize clipper guards, but his eyes kept noticing Marcus's silence, the way he paused too long between simple movements, like a man carrying something invisible that was slowly becoming too heavy to hide. Outside, a bus passed and its light washed through the window for a moment, turning the shop gold and then cold again, and Marcus briefly closed his eyes as if that flicker could reset something inside him. He had built this place from nothing after arriving from Jamaica at 22, believing that hard work could anchor a man in a new country. But tonight that belief felt fragile, like hairline cracks spreading across glass. The envelope under the counter had arrived 3 days ago, but Marcus had told no one, not even the landlord who smiled too politely during rent conversations that felt less like dialogue and more like countdowns. He told himself he just needed time. Just one more week of full chairs and steady cash flow. But the truth sat heavier with every passing hour. As he turned off the main clippers and the shop settled into deeper quiet, Marcus looked at the empty barber chair, the red leather worn smooth by years of stories, and for a brief moment he imagined it speaking back to him, asking how much longer a man can keep pretending everything is fine when his entire world is already beginning to slip away. Morning came too quickly for Marcus Hale, not because he had slept, but because he had not, and the barbershop already felt different under daylight, as if the night had been honest and the day was pretending nothing was wrong. He unlocked the front door just before 9 in the morning, flipped the neon sign from closed to open, and watched the first wave of Brooklyn noise slowly fill the street outside. Delivery trucks, distant sirens, people rushing toward jobs that all looked more secure than his own. Caleb was already inside, sweeping the floor with slow, careful movements, and when Marcus entered, the young apprentice looked up for a moment, noticing that same quiet tension still sitting in his mentor's shoulders, unchanged from the night before. Marcus nodded as if everything was normal, then immediately went to the mirror station, organizing combs that were already perfectly aligned, because it gave his hands something to do while his mind refused to stay still. A customer came in mid-morning, a regular named David who always talked too much about sports and weather, and Marcus cut his hair with practiced precision, smiling at the right moments, laughing softly when expected, but his eyes kept drifting to the reflection of that hidden white envelope he had tucked deeper behind the counter before opening the shop. Every snip of the scissors sounded sharper today, like time itself was being trimmed away too quickly. Caleb watched quietly from the corner, noticing how Marcus paused for half a second longer than usual before every movement, like a man carefully balancing on something invisible. Between clients, Marcus checked his phone twice, both times pretending it was nothing, but there were no new messages except a reminder from the bank about an overdue balance that made his jaw tighten for a brief moment before he forced it loose again. Around noon, the shop filled with a small burst of life, 2 chairs occupied at once, laughter bouncing off the mirrors, but Marcus felt separated from it all. as if he were standing just outside his own existence, observing a version of himself that still belonged here while the real weight of his situation remained locked in silence behind the counter. When a brief lull came, Caleb finally asked a harmless question about the schedule for the weekend, but Marcus hesitated too long before answering, and that hesitation spoke louder than words. Outside, the sunlight shifted across the floor, stretching toward the back room where the envelope waited, patient and undeniable, and Marcus realized that no matter how many haircuts he completed today, no matter how many smiles he performed, something fundamental had already begun to close in around him, quiet but absolute, like a door that would not stay open much longer. The afternoon rush arrived without warning, as if the city had pressed a switch and suddenly every chair in the barbershop needed to be filled at once, and Marcus Hale moved through it with the same controlled rhythm he had always trusted, even though something inside him felt increasingly misaligned with every passing hour. The radio in the corner shifted to a slower song, a soft soul track that seemed to stretch the air inside the shop, and for a brief moment Marcus let himself breathe in time with it while he guided the clippers along a customer's fade. Caleb stood near the front mirror, pretending to clean already clean surfaces, but his attention kept drifting toward Marcus, especially every time Marcus glanced toward the back counter where the white envelope remained hidden but never forgotten. By mid-afternoon, the shop was full again, conversations overlapping, laughter rising and falling, but Marcus noticed something strange in his own reflection each time he passed the mirror, a subtle distance in his eyes, like he was watching himself perform a role he could no longer fully believe in. Between clients, he stepped into the small storage room, closed the door gently, and finally pulled out the envelope with careful hands, staring at the printed notice without opening it again, as if the words might change if he waited long enough, but they did not. A sharp vibration broke the silence, his phone lighting up with an unknown number, and after a pause he answered, only to hear the landlord's voice calm and practiced, reminding him that the deadline was approaching and that patience was not something the building could afford. Marcus said very little, only enough to end the call politely, then stood there longer than necessary, staring at the wall as if it might offer a different outcome. When he returned to the main floor, Caleb immediately noticed the shift in his posture, but neither of them spoke about it. A young client in the chair asked Marcus how long he had been cutting hair in Brooklyn, and Marcus smiled while answering, but his mind drifted briefly back to the day he first arrived in New York at 22, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and a belief that consistency could protect a man from falling. Now, years later, that belief felt thinner, like fabric worn too many times. As the afternoon light shifted across the floor and the shop slowly began to empty again, Marcus slipped the envelope back into its hiding place, pressing it deeper as if hiding it physically could delay its reality, but even as he resumed cutting hair, the weight of it remained present in every movement, every pause, every forced smile that now carried a quiet urgency no one else in the room could fully see. The evening light began to fade earlier than Marcus Hale expected, as if the city itself was trying to shorten the day, and inside the barbershop the warm glow of the lamps grew stronger against the rising blue darkness outside, creating a fragile balance between comfort and pressure that Marcus could feel in every breath he took. The final wave of customers came in one after another, but Marcus noticed that his hands were no longer moving purely on instinct. There was now a slight hesitation between each motion, as if part of his focus was permanently divided between the present moment and the unseen weight waiting behind the counter. Caleb was still sweeping near the entrance, but he had slowed down too, watching Marcus more openly now, sensing that something unspoken had settled over the shop like a low ceiling that neither of them could reach above. During a brief pause between clients, Marcus stepped behind the counter again, this time not to hide the envelope but to check it, his fingers pressing against its edge as if confirming it was still real, still there, still unavoidable. The sound of the front door opening interrupted him, and he quickly returned to the floor just as a regular customer walked in, laughing loudly about traffic and work, completely unaware of the quiet fracture forming in the man cutting his hair. Marcus smiled, asked the usual questions, and performed the routine perfectly, but his reflection in the mirror betrayed him in small ways, a delayed blink, a slightly unfocused gaze, a stillness that did not belong to the rhythm of the shop. Outside, a delivery truck passed slowly, its headlights dragging across the window and briefly illuminating the envelope's hiding place, as if the world outside was trying to expose what Marcus was refusing to see. When the customer left, Caleb finally broke his silence and asked if everything was okay, his voice careful, not intrusive, but Marcus answered too quickly, saying everything was fine in a tone that almost convinced no one, least of all himself. The radio shifted again to a softer, older song, and for a moment Marcus stood still with the clippers in his hand, listening to the music as if it might offer instructions on how to continue. He thought about Jamaica, about arriving in Brooklyn with nothing but determination and a belief that steady work could hold a life together. But now that belief felt like something he had been borrowing for too long. As the last customer of the night settled into the chair, Marcus exhaled slowly and returned to the familiar motion of cutting hair. But even as the clippers moved, his mind stayed locked on the envelope behind him, a silent presence growing heavier with every passing minute, waiting for the night to end and for the truth he had been avoiding to finally step into the light. The night deepened quickly over Brooklyn, and by the time Marcus Hale locked the front door for what should have been the end of another ordinary workday, the barbershop no longer felt like a place of routine but like a vessel carrying something that was slowly becoming too heavy to contain. Caleb had already finished sweeping and was pretending to organize the final station, but his movements lacked energy now, as if he too could feel the invisible pressure building inside the room. Marcus moved through his closing routine with practiced precision, wiping mirrors, aligning chairs, and counting cash, but every action felt slightly delayed. Like his body was following instructions his mind was no longer fully committed to. When the last customer had left 10 minutes earlier, Marcus had noticed something different in his own reflection, not exhaustion but recognition, as if he was beginning to understand that the envelope behind the counter was not just a piece of paper anymore but a countdown that had already started without his permission. Caleb finally broke the silence again, asking if Marcus wanted help cleaning up faster so they could both leave earlier, but Marcus hesitated for a moment too long before answering, and that hesitation filled the room more than any words could. He nodded, then turned away, walking slowly toward the back counter where the white envelope remained exactly where he had left it, untouched but never forgotten. For the first time he did not hide it or avoid it, instead he placed it flat on the counter under the yellow light, staring at it for several seconds as if waiting for it to change into something less final. The radio had stopped playing music, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator in the corner, and the distant sound of traffic outside. And in that silence Marcus felt the full weight of every year he had spent building this life in Brooklyn. Caleb watched from a distance, not interrupting, sensing that something important was happening, even if he did not understand what it was. Marcus finally sat down in the empty barber chair, the same red leather seat where so many lives had been shared, and for a moment he allowed himself to stop performing, letting the truth settle into his posture, his hands resting still for the first time all day. He thought about the years he had promised himself that stability would come if he just worked harder, stayed longer, never complained, but the envelope in front of him suggested a different reality, one that did not reward endurance the way he had always believed. Outside, the neon sign flickered faintly, casting a broken glow across the glass, and Marcus realized that even if he continued cutting hair tomorrow, something irreversible had already begun tonight, not with noise or conflict, but with silence that finally refused to be ignored. The knock on the front door came earlier than Marcus Hale expected, sharp and sudden enough to cut through the silence of the closing barbershop, and for a moment he did not move, as if the sound itself had frozen him in place. Caleb looked up from the cleaning station, confusion in his eyes, while Marcus slowly rose from the empty barber chair, his attention locked on the entrance like he already knew who was standing on the other side. The second knock was firmer, followed by a voice identifying itself as the property management office, and that single sentence seemed to drain the remaining air from the room. Marcus walked toward the door without speaking, each step heavier than the last, while the white envelope on the counter suddenly felt less like a secret and more like an inevitability catching up to him. He opened the door just enough to speak, and a neatly dressed representative handed him another document, this one final in tone, confirming what he had already been avoiding since the first notice arrived. Marcus said nothing for several seconds, only nodding once in a way that tried to maintain dignity even as something inside him tightened. When the door closed again, the sound echoed through the barbershop like a decision that could not be reversed. Caleb, still standing near the mirrors, did not ask questions immediately, but his silence carried concern that was now impossible to ignore. Marcus returned to the counter and placed both documents side by side, the original envelope and the new notice, as if comparing two versions of the same ending. For The first time he did not try to hide them or push them away. Instead, he stared at them with the kind of exhaustion that came not from a single day, but from years of holding everything together without letting anyone see the cracks. The radio remained off, and the barbershop felt larger and emptier than it ever had before, as if the walls themselves were pulling away from him. Caleb finally stepped closer, asking quietly if there was anything he could do, but Marcus shook his head slowly, not in rejection, but in acceptance that this was something no one else could fix. Outside, a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping across the floor, briefly illuminating the red barber chair where so many stories had been told, and Marcus realized that even if he continued to work tomorrow, the place he had built was already standing on borrowed time. He sat down again, this time not to rest, but to face what could no longer be delayed, while the silence around him grew deeper, not empty, but final in a way that changed everything without making a sound. The silence inside the barbershop after the second notice felt different to Marcus Hale, no longer like tension building, but like something already decided, and even the familiar sounds of the city outside, the distant traffic and occasional siren, seemed to exist in another world that no longer included him in the same way. Caleb had stopped pretending to clean and now stood near the mirror station, watching Marcus with a stillness that carried more understanding than words could offer, as if he had finally realized that the weight in the room was not temporary but structural, like a foundation slowly giving way. Marcus remained seated in the red barber chair, the same chair where he had shaped hundreds of lives through conversation and silence, but tonight it felt less like a place of work and more like a place of reckoning. The documents lay on the counter in front of him, no longer hidden, no longer avoided, and the presence of both notices together created a finality that Marcus could not negotiate with anymore. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor as if searching for a version of himself that still believed this situation could be repaired through effort alone. Caleb finally stepped closer, breaking the distance carefully, and asked if Marcus had somewhere to go if things changed, and the question landed softly but deeply, because Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked up at the mirror, seeing not just his reflection but the accumulation of years, the long hours, the sacrifices, and the quiet belief that persistence would eventually be enough. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but worn, saying that he had always assumed work would protect him, that consistency would create safety, but the words now sounded like they belonged to someone he used to be rather than who he had become. The shop lights flickered slightly, and in that brief instability Marcus felt something shift inside him, not panic, but recognition that the situation had already moved beyond delay. Caleb, unsure how to respond, simply nodded and stood back again, respecting the silence that followed. Marcus then slowly reached for the envelope and the new notice, holding them both in his hands for a long moment, as if weighing not just paper but the entire structure of his life in Brooklyn. Outside, a car passed and its headlights swept across the floor, briefly illuminating the red chair and the empty stations around him, and in that light Marcus understood something clear and irreversible, that the life he had built was not collapsing suddenly, but ending gradually, one quiet confirmation at a time, and the only thing left now was how he would choose to stand inside that ending. The barbershop felt quieter than ever when Marcus Hale returned to the red barber chair that night, not because the city had stopped making noise, but because he had finally stopped filtering it through hope, and everything now arrived at him raw and unprotected. Caleb had already turned off most of the lights, leaving only the main lamp above the mirror glowing, casting long shadows across the empty stations that once held the rhythm of a normal workday. Marcus sat still, holding both notices in his hands, no longer reading them because reading had become unnecessary, like a ritual he had already completed in his mind too many times. For the first time he did not try to solve anything, did not calculate hours or payments or possibilities. He simply sat inside the reality that had been building quietly for weeks. Caleb approached slowly, breaking the distance with caution, and asked if Marcus wanted help packing anything important, and that question landed differently than before, because it assumed continuation rather than denial. Marcus looked up at him, and for a brief moment there was something almost like relief in his expression, not because the situation had improved, but because pretending had finally become impossible. He nodded slightly, then stood up and walked toward the back room where his small personal belongings were kept, a place that had always felt temporary even when he told himself it was not. Inside the storage space, He opened a simple metal cabinet and pulled out a few items, old photographs, a faded license, and a small notebook filled with names of clients who had come and gone over the years, each one representing a moment of connection that now felt suspended in time. Caleb followed quietly and watched from the doorway, realizing that what Marcus was gathering was not just belongings, but evidence of a life built one conversation at a time. When Marcus returned to the main floor, he placed everything gently on the counter next to the notices, as if aligning his past with his present and acknowledging that they were now part of the same story. The neon sign outside flickered again, briefly illuminating the empty street, and Marcus noticed how the reflection in the window no longer showed a man in control of a place, but a man standing at the edge of something that had already shifted beneath him. Caleb finally spoke again, asking what would happen next, and Marcus answered honestly for the first time, saying he did not know, but that he would not run from it anymore. The words were simple, but they changed the atmosphere in the room, replacing tension with something quieter and heavier. Acceptance without resolution. As the night deepened further, Marcus remained standing in the center of the barbershop, surrounded by the tools of his life's work, understanding that the ending was not arriving all at once, but unfolding slowly around him, and the only thing left to decide was how he would walk through it when morning came. The first light of morning entered the barbershop slowly, slipping through the front glass and touching the red barber chair where Marcus Hale had remained seated for what felt like hours, not because he was waiting for anything anymore, but because he was learning how to sit with a truth that no longer required resistance. The notices were still on the counter, side by side, no longer treated as threats but as markers of a chapter that had already been written, and Caleb stood quietly near the mirror, no longer anxious, only present, as if understanding that some endings do not arrive suddenly but settle in like weather. Marcus finally stood and looked around the room, not with loss but with recognition, seeing every chair, every mirror, every tool not as something being taken from him, but as something that had once held pieces of his life with meaning. He walked slowly along the stations, touching the arm of each chair briefly, not to hold on but to acknowledge, as if saying goodbye without needing words. Caleb asked softly if he would come back later that day, and Marcus paused before answering, then said he did not know what the next place would look like, but he knew he would continue cutting hair wherever he was needed, because that part of him was not tied to walls or ownership. There was no anger in his voice, only clarity, and that clarity changed the air inside the shop in a way that felt lighter even as it remained uncertain. Marcus returned to the counter one last time and folded the notices carefully, placing them into the same notebook that held years of client names, not as a reminder of failure, but as part of a longer story that was still unfolding. Caleb stepped forward and offered to help carry things, but Marcus shook his head gently, saying that some journeys begin when you are the only one walking them, fully aware of each step. Outside, the city had already begun its morning rhythm, cars passing, people moving toward work, and life continuing without pause, but Marcus no longer felt separated from it, only newly aligned with its uncertainty. Before leaving, he stood at the entrance and looked back at the barbershop, the red chair, the neon sign now dim in daylight, and he understood that what he was losing was not the ability to work, but a place that had once carried him through survival into belonging. He stepped outside without hurry, closing the door behind him not as an ending, but as a transition, and as he walked down the Brooklyn sidewalk, the weight he had carried for so long no longer felt like something breaking him, but something that had finally made room for what would come next.